Palestinian leadership has stated clearly in recent weeks that we cannot continue on a path that so far failed to produce an end to the Israeli military occupation, failed to give the Palestinians the freedom and the independence that they deserve. There are currently many diplomatic efforts right now that are aimed at breaking the impasse, and they are mainly being conducted between the United States and Israel directly. So far, there is nothing in the horizon to indicate that Prime Minister Netanyahu has shifted his position, and he once again has signaled that he will continue to build settlements in defiance of not only the United States but international law as well, making it difficult for the Palestinians to return to the negotiating table and to resume the direct talks that we started with them in September. So another issue I want to touch on is I said that we want to talk about myths of past negotiations between Israel and the PLO. In 2000, President Bill Clinton hosted a summit called the Camp David Summit, and Chairman Arafat at the time, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, met for 12 days at Camp David trying to reach an agreement to end the conflict between the two sides, but almost 2 weeks after the negotiations collapsed and could not produce any results, and the Palestinians at the time were blamed for the failure of Camp David. And everybody accused the Palestinians of turning down the generous offer that the Israelis offered to them, and accused the Palestinians of once again missing another opportunity to achieve peace and end the conflict with Israel. The fact is that there was no offer by the Israelis at Camp David. Nothing whatsoever. Nothing whatsoever. Nothing written, nothing verbal, and all what the Israelis were talking about was only discussions between the two sides. And as a matter of fact, the only paper that was submitted in Camp David was a Palestinian paper on the refugees that was submitted to the Israeli side, and until today, 10 years later, we have not received a response to that letter. So the Israeli generous offer maybe was generous compared to Israeli previous offers, but it was not enough to convince the Palestinians that what the Israelis are offering will allow for the establishment of an independent and sovereign Palestinian state. Why? The Israelis wanted to keep control of our international crossing points. They want to have control of who comes in and who goes out from our own territories. They wanted to create 3 early warning systems inside the future Palestinian state, 1 in the north, 1 in the center, and 1 in the south. They wanted to have the right to deploy rapid deployment forces inside the Palestinian state if and when they are threatened by attack from the east. At the time, of course, Saddam Hussein was still in power in Iraq, and the Israelis, same way they are using Iran today, they were saying that Iraq could attack and they need to be able to fend off any attack that comes from the east. Another demand the Israelis wanted was to control our airspace. They wanted us to give them the right to hold military maneuvers or Air Force maneuvers in our airspace and not allow for us to have any control over our airspace. Another area they wanted to control was the electromagnetic sphere. They wanted to have total control over our electromagnetic sphere. And then people after that ask us, why did you reject the Israeli offer? This is not an offer to create an independent Palestinian state. This is an offer to legitimize the occupation and tell them that we will remain under your protection for the rest of our life. And in addition to that, they have not discussed the issue of Jerusalem, and they have not discussed the issue of the refugees, which is very, very fundamental to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. That's why we rejected the offer. It's not because we didn't want to end the conflict with Israel and we didn't want to make peace with Israel. Israel is following the same mentality again in their current negotiations with us today. They are demanding that they keep forces in our land after we reach an agreement. They want to have control over our airspace. They want to have control over our electromagnetic sphere. And they are following the same mentality and the same behavior that they have followed 10 years ago, which only tells us that they are not serious about ending this conflict and that they want to prolong the occupation. They believe that they can keep the status quo that is existing today in the occupied Palestinian territories, because Israel is in a situation where they are not paying anything to keep and maintain their occupation. In the past, when the Palestinians were under direct Israeli occupation, it's true, the Israelis used to collect $600 million in taxes from the Palestinians, again, a violation of international law, because an occupying power should not be collecting taxes from the occupied people. But they have done that for almost 36 years without anybody telling them that you cannot do that. They kept collecting $600 million a year. They spent $150 million on the Palestinians, providing them with services, and they kept the $450 million to support their military occupation of the West Bank. After 1993, the Israelis pulled out from certain areas and allowed for the Palestinian Authority to run the daily life of the Palestinians. Today, Israel has security and military control of the Palestinian areas, while the Palestinians have civilian control, and the international community today is subsidizing the Israeli occupation of Israel, of Palestine, because the Israelis are no longer paying for their occupation. They are only controlling the land from a security point of view, and the international community, including the United States, is now subsidizing the Israeli occupation by providing assistance and aid to the Palestinian Authority, while the Israelis are maintaining their occupation of the Palestinian land. And this is, again, a situation that we cannot tolerate any longer, because Israel must understand that the continuation of the occupation has a price. They cannot continue to occupy another people. It's the only military occupation left in the world. The only military occupation. You cannot think of any other military occupation but the Israeli military occupation of the Palestinians. So, to conclude, I think Israel is faced with three options today. Option number one, they can accept our offer and our hand, which is extended to make peace with them, and accept the establishment of a totally independent, sovereign Palestinian state in the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, which will be on 22% of historic Palestine, and a just resolution to the Palestinian refugee problem, and create a state that can live side by side with Israel in peace and security. End the conflict, end all historical claims. And that's it. This is not a tactical ploy. It's not the first step to take over the remainder of Palestine, as some Israelis claim. No, this will be the end game for us. West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, a just resolution to the Palestinian refugee problem. And in my view, I think this is the most ideal solution, because it will help both Palestinians and Israelis to maintain and preserve their national identities. The second option is for Israel to continue with the status quo, and to continue with their policies on the ground, and to impose facts on the ground, and to discriminate against the Palestinians, thus turning the West Bank and the occupied territory in an apartheid-like areas where Palestinians are being discriminated against. In the West Bank today, there are roads that can be used by Israeli settlers, and Palestinians cannot use them. Not even in the darkest ages of apartheid South Africa, they separated blacks and whites from using public roads. And we see that in the West Bank today. Maybe not too many of you know this fact, but it is a fact on the ground in the West Bank. So Israel has a moral dilemma here. Do they want to be accused of promoting apartheid and discrimination, and then slowly but surely lose their moral ground, fighting to create a homeland for Jews and to live in peace with their neighbors? I think it will be difficult to sustain this option. But if we cannot achieve the two-state solution and Israel cannot maintain the status quo, then I think there is an increasing support for the notion of a binational one state, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians can all live in peace and equality on the same land. And given the projections of experts, within 20 years, the number of non-Jews between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea will exceed that, or will be equal to that of Jews living in that area. And then Israel will be faced with a demographic dilemma and problem, because the only way to solve that demographic problem is to transfer the Palestinians out of their land. And I don't think this is going to be a feasible option for Israel. I don't think that the international community will tolerate that. So I think the two-state solution is becoming more difficult because of Israeli actions on the ground, but it remains our strategic objective, our strategic goal, and I hope that the Israeli leadership will start to concentrate on the long-term interest of Israel, the long-term benefits of Israel, not only about short-term and tactical gains and achievements, because it's in Israel's interest to end the conflict with the Palestinians. The only way peace and stability can prevail in the Middle East if a Palestinian state is established. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll ask now Dr. Smith and Dr. Susser if they have any comments, and then we can move into the Q&A period. Let me give you the microphones.